Well, welcome to Going Online, Reimagining Teaching and Learning. It's great to have you with us. Yes, I'm back. I'm your host, Claire Macken, Deputy Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Learning and Teaching in the College of Business and Law at RMIT University. And today I'm in Texa green to match the slides. I'm still in my gym pants. I'm very much looking forward to getting my kids back to school next week. And Texa, in collaboration with RMIT, having invited experts from higher education all around the sector to discuss things all online learning. And today is the third of our webinar series. In session one, we looked at getting started, best practice for establishing online learning. Last week, we discussed with our expert panel, enabling staff to work in an online learning environment. And today we're addressing the important topic of assessment integrity. Whilst we're talking about websites, if you would like to see Texa's privacy policy, you can see it at texa.gov.au/privacy. Today's webinar is being recorded to share online, and it may be used by Texa in a number of different ways. And before we start, I would like to hand over to one of our panelists today, Professor Belinda Tynan, to give us our acknowledgement of country. I'll introduce you more fully to Belinda after our acknowledgement. Thanks, Belinda.
Thanks, Claire. It's such a pleasure to be here today and to be able to provide an acknowledgement of country. I'd just like to personalise it a little bit to the area that I live in. I know that there's sort of more than 300 or so people here today, and you're all probably sitting on different land and in different parts of our wonderful country, Australia, and that you will be paying your respect to the cultures and the country that you're currently on, as I pay my respect to the country that I'm on here. I'm from Melbourne, and I'm considered a North Sider, and the lands that I sit on belong to the Eastern Kulin Nations, and the particular area which I'm attached to is the Wurundjeri Willam group of the Wiberong. And that includes this fantastic run and waterway called Merri Creek. So for those of you who are in Melbourne who know that, you'll probably know where I'm talking about. But for the rest of the country, if you ever visit Melbourne and would like to explore some of our fantastic bike paths, the Merri Creek is a really huge bike path that goes all the way around the city. It's pretty amazing, actually. But this particular area that I'm in is it's Fitzroy North, and Merri Creek's right on my doorstep. And recently, when I was looking up a little bit more about the country and land that I'm on, I found out that John Batman signed Australia's only ever treaty that was ever signed with an Indigenous group, and it was the Wurundjeri Willam group. I was fascinated by this. In fact, what they signed was pretty awful. But needless to say that we did have a treaty at some point, but it was later declared invalid by Sir Richard Burke. Which is a pity, I guess, but probably not, given what they were signing up to. I love the Merri Creek bike path, and you can often find me sort of running along that path, and I enjoy going in both directions, and I hope that those who aren't in Melbourne, that you might enjoy that one day too. It's a really special place, and it was obviously very special to those people of the Willam family as well. So with that, I will acknowledge on behalf of all of us the lands that we all sit on today, regardless of which country you are on. Texa acknowledges the traditional owners of this country and our connection to land and how deep that is for all of us, the waters and the community. We pay our respects to their cultures, country and elders past, present and emerging. Back to you, Claire.
Thanks, Belinda. So let me introduce you now to our audience. So Professor Belinda Tynan, one of our two panellists today, is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Education and Vice President at RMIT University. She's responsible for the student journey from enrolment to graduation. Belinda has 30+ years of experience in transformative leadership in education across Australia, New Zealand, Singapore and the UK. And in 2019, she was named in the Australian Financial Review's Top 100 Women of Influence, and in 2020 was announced the Victorian Public Sector and Academia winner in the 2020 Telstra Business Women's Awards. Great achievements. Our other panellist today is Dr. Margot McNeill, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Learning and Teaching at the International College of Management, Sydney. Margot is responsible for teams leading academic operations, quality and innovation in learning and teaching, learning technologies and professional development initiatives, as well as the Work Integrated Learning Unit, Library and Student Success Centre. Just a few things. Prior to this role, she has held a range of senior management positions and consultations in both higher education and vocational sectors, public and private, in Australia and New Zealand. Margot's research interests and much of her strategic leadership explores technologies for learning, teaching and assessment, change management, and staff capability building. She is currently a research team member on Texas Academic Integrity Initiative, facilitating a series of workshops across Australia and New Zealand and developing a toolkit to be shared across the sector. So just a reminder to our audience, the format that we have for our series is that we ask our panelists just one question and then it's over to you. So give us a lot of questions, put them into the chat there, and let's get started. The first question is for Margot. With the COVID-19 pandemic, many institutions have implemented online learning. So how can we ensure integrity of assessment?
Thanks very much, Claire, and welcome everyone. I'll respond to the question in two parts, the what and the how of ensuring assessment integrity. First, by way of brief context, ICMS is an independent provider with a proud tradition of career-focused, face-to-face education. And then a couple of years ago, we began planning to have our new suite of undergraduate courses accredited for online delivery. So fortunately for us, that meant that we'd been recruiting experienced staff, we'd built the professional development framework, and any of the new subjects had been designed for fully online delivery. So then, when we lurched forward in response to the COVID-19 situation, we did have some of those critical building blocks in place. I mentioned starting with the what. That's clear alignment between the subject learning outcomes and the assessment task. So based on the principles of constructive alignment and backwards design, our program managers worked with their learning teams and the learning designers to basically start with assessment. Whatever the face-to-face assessment tasks were, they needed to be transitioned to online very rapidly. So field trips were exchanged for case studies, and all group projects had to be completed online rather than in class. A task, for example, in a course called Bar and Mixology was adjusted so that the students recorded themselves making a cocktail at home and reflecting on the process, rather than doing that in class. We'd already been moving away from closed book exams, but some did have to be redesigned as take-home exams or alternative tasks. But importantly, they need to meet the same learning outcomes. And I'll also say that pedagogy drove all of our technology decisions. Now, moving on to the how, that includes bringing the teaching staff along the change journey. So we surveyed the staff to gauge their confidence levels and what technology they would need for home-based delivery. Then we set up a learning and teaching hub to share good practice as the champions began to emerge, and also to troubleshoot about assessment design. We have a learning and teaching principle that all teaching hours will include at least 30% of student activity. So that transferred very well into Zoom webinars. Teaching staff worked backwards from the assessment tasks to ensure that the students had clear guidance about exactly what they needed to do in the adjusted tasks. Communicating clear instructions about assessment and reminding students about the importance of academic integrity are also part of the how. We have a set of Moodle minimum standards to ensure that there's consistency about assessment information in all subjects. And then a focus on the process leading to the task as well as the end product is built in. For example, reflections might require links to specific learning materials covered in this subject rather than more generic ones. And all students were informed that they might need to participate in a Viva and that they should retain their drafts. And finally, the changes introduced in assessment do need to be monitored and reported through the usual governance processes, including both the what and the how. So, for example, we adjusted our student satisfaction survey to focus on what we could improve for the next trimester, and we also probed the teacher experience in the end of term sign-offs. I'll say it's a work in progress because we haven't finished the end of our term yet, but the outcomes so far have been great. So that's a brief overview of how we ensure assessment integrity in these recent strange months. And now I'll hand back to Claire.
Thanks, Margot. I'm going across to Belinda now. A question for you, similar question actually. How do you assess in an online environment and assure academic integrity?
It's such a big question, Claire, isn't it? It's just huge because it's really difficult in the, not only in the current environment, just sort of generally, you know, when we're working our assessments, whether you're online or whether you're offline, you're going to have very similar issues. Probably three things with some other stuff that I'll throw in around it is that it's really important that we're thinking about the constructive alignment of our curriculum and how we contextualise and apply knowledge, and asking our students in a sense to provide us with evidence of how their ideas have evolved in those contexts. Assessment design is actually really important in this piece, and really aiming and focusing on the higher order aspects of the taxonomies that we're very familiar with, you know, like the Bloom's taxonomies, etc. You know, trying to shift away from recall-oriented assessment activities. And of course, you know, engagement and motivation is a really huge piece about how you contain and maintain academic credibility just with our learners themselves. If they're engaged and more motivated about their learning and what their learning is trying to achieve for them, and providing them with opportunities for choice, you're probably also going to reduce stress, which is a really big part of, you know, why students often choose the wrong path. They're not always trying to subvert the system. Sometimes they're very stressed and they act and react in particular ways, which many of the audience here will know. So just sort of practical tips and things that, you know, that I think about when we're designing assessment in particular. It's about not reusing assessment if you can. It's making sure that all assessment has unique components and unique elements to it. And that might only need a minor tweak. And that helps us keep ahead of some of those pesky websites where people have got the assessments up there. They can't just sort of reuse things. It's also about setting realistic assessments. You know, assessment's not there to trick the learner. It is to actually assess outcomes. And so that's another thing to think about, is that, you know, a student that has been well prepared through great learning activities is more likely to be successful in an assessment because they've been set up for that success. I think the other thing is that if we're communicating well what those learning outcomes are, and that assessment is tied to that, that will also help the student prepare. There's a whole range of other things too around setting expectations with students. At RMIT, we have a mini credential, a micro credential that our students do around academic integrity. And it's about us as a university saying very explicitly up front what our expectation is about what does it mean to plagiarise, what does it mean to cheat, and what does that look like in our context? And then most importantly, well, what are the consequences for that? Now, it's our most popular credential, and I think to date we've had something ridiculous like 15,000 students just take that. And we're trying to get as many of our academic staff as possible to put that credential as a key entry point into the university so that students understand, you know, what that all means. We also have training for our staff. You know, it's quite interesting when you talk to people about, well, give me your definition of academic integrity. Everyone will have a slightly different interpretation of that. So depending on your policy and your context and how that actually aligns to the Texas standards as well, it's then really quite important that they understand what it means in this context and how they need to operate as well in order to support their students to understand what it means for them. Other things too that we use quite frequently in the online environment include things like online quizzes. And nothing wrong with a good online quiz, and you can actually assess at quite high order levels. It's not all about recall. Questions need to be constructed very well, but having a bank of questions makes it a lot harder for someone to cheat, actually. And if they're ongoing, they are randomised and they're consistently updated, you'll find that's another very effective mechanisms as well. Timed assessments is something that people use in the online environment because they think that sort of stops and mediates, academic credibility. But my view is that can also be very stressful. It's a personal view. I prefer not to have so many timed assessments because I think that, again, I hate this idea that we're trying to trick our students. We're trying to get them to demonstrate what they know and what knowledge they have. And so rather than sort of try to trip them up, but I mean, again, you can debate that with me. And I've had some very robust debates with people about, my ideas around trickery in assessments. The other thing too around short answers and take-home exams and open book type stuff, I think it's really important to ensure students have the opportunity to personalise the assessment in some way, where they have to draw upon a personal experience of their own, or they have to draw upon maybe something that was said in a lecture or in the things that you may have given them to refer to as part of their course, that would make it very hard for one of those essay mills or short answer mills or other people to cheat to actually be able to provide that input as well. There are lots and lots of other things, around using viva voce if you're unsure about something that a student has submitted, so you can sort of, if in doubt, you can check to see what they actually know. Can they say it to you? And of course, comparing writing styles, for example, there's quite a movement in that space as well. And of course, some people are using proctoring, and have got all sort of that virtual testing going on in that space, and biometrics, which are helping identify, the identity with people, because primarily the issue around proctoring is it the actual person who's sitting in front of the camera is the right person? Is the identity correct? And then are they managing to cheat in some way? So I might leave it there, Claire. I think just to end off with is that basically I'd say more carrot and less stick is probably going to get a greater outcome in the academic integrity piece. So back over to you.
Thanks, Belinda. Totally agree. And I love your advice as well. So I have a question for Margot now. What specific steps actionable by unis it says AdTechs are taking to respond to contract cheating in the post-COVID period, but Margot can't speak on behalf of TEXA, but can give us advice on the specific steps that can be taken to respond to contract cheating in the post-COVID period. Over to you, Margot.
Okay, thanks, Claire. And I guess I'll start with a reiteration of Belinda's point about more carrot and less stick. There's lots of research over, 4 decades or something about academic integrity, and much more recently this notion of contract cheating. But we do know from several studies that nothing is actually beyond students cheating. If they really are committed to cheating, there have been examples of things like their doctoral thesis and their various presentations they've had to do that they've basically outsourced. But there are a few things that are very actionable for institutions. For example, we know that students are much less likely to engage in contract cheating if they feel satisfied with the learning environment, they know what they need to do, because anxiety is a big part of the driver for that, resorting to someone else to do the work, and that they know that the tasks are designed for authenticity. So that means we need to take care with giving the students very clear instructions. Some of the great examples we've seen in the studies that we've been doing are things like engaging students with the activities and letting them know where to find everything before they go home and do their work themselves. And that can still happen in the online environment. Say, for example, you're in Zoom. If you have a demonstration of what's required, and the students can start working on the task, for example, in breakout rooms, that helps them build their confidence. It helps them understand why they need to do these things, and it lets them know what's required. So I'd also refer people back to the text standards, thinking about what you need to do to demonstrate your clear policies. that you're letting students know what's required and you educate them in this process, and that you also monitor what's happening so that you can identify trends and start analysing some of the subjects that, for example, have trends increasing. At our place, we often look at the links between, if there are a couple of examples of any type of academic integrity breach, it sometimes links with an increased communication to the Student Success Centre. That's our academic learning advice team. So they might get lots of questions about a task, and then suddenly we find a couple of students resort to cheating. Therefore, there's a clear link for us to explore to actually fix the problem with the assessment in the first place. So try and engage with your students, inform them how important it is that they actually learn this information, and build tasks that help them demonstrate their confidence over time. And then you get to see them. The beauty of any Zoom is you can record them. So then if you need to go back and see the level of students' performance, that's actually possible in lots of group tasks as well. So I'll stop there and hand back over to Claire. Oh, I should also say the toolkit will be available very soon, and that's got lots of case studies and some of the things like the benchmarking tools people might find helpful on the TEXA website.
Excellent. And just recommending the TEXA website, there's some amazing things on there, lots of advice, step-by-step guides, and of course our previous webinars. Belinda, over to you. Is this the end of short answer content-based exams? By content-based, I mean not application process-based, and therefore easy to find the answer online.
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know how to answer that one, because I think it will depend in a sense about how you define and view what you're assessing, you know, and then you use the right tool for the outcomes you want to see examined in a sense. So I don't think I'd be definite about saying it's the end of anything in particular. What I would say is that, you know, and just to support what Margot and build on what Margot was saying there, is that there is something that we could all potentially look more to in the future around, you know, cumulative assessment that actually demonstrates knowledge over time, that reduces stress from the student, but is potentially then focused on giving students opportunity to practice. And I've seen a lot of sort of examples where students can, you know, do 4 or 5 activities, and then you take a mean score across the piece, or students, you know, select the 3 best works, which then create their final score, etc. So I think there's a lot of innovative ways to sort of think about how you, you know, can take stress out of the system so that students don't feel a need to compromise the academic, you know, integrity of the moment they find themselves in. And then I'd probably also say something around, you know, authentic assessment, you know, and, you know, for me, it's been, I'm absolutely delighted that, you know, there's a silver lining for me around the what's happened with the COVID piece, and that, you know, we've basically stopped almost all of our exams, and we're a very large institution, you know, 96,000 students. It's a lot of exams through the piece, and to have sort of gone from, you know, a strategy in our university to move away from exams more towards authentic assessment that was going to take between 3 and 5 years has basically taken 3 months. We have very quickly grappled with the notion of, well, what does an authentic assessment look like, and how can we assure its academic integrity, and using multiple range of, you know, type short answer questions, essay questions, quizzes, cumulative assessment. I wouldn't say we're getting it 100% right yet. We're still on a journey in terms of figuring that out. You know, the pedagogical process of supporting our teachers and our academics, all that takes time, but people are hungry to know how to do it now. So I might leave my answer at that. I didn't really answer the question, but hopefully I've given you some other ideas to think about.
Thanks, Belinda. And I can just say from the College of Business and Law, where I am, it's been a huge shift away from face-to-face invigilated exams to a variety of authentic assessments. It's been a massive job. So question for, okay guys, the questions this week, you're not up to the standard of previous weeks. So I'm going out there to our audience for a call for questions. There's lots of you on here, you must have some. So keep posting the questions so I can ask some of our panelists. And I do have a few though. So my next question's for Margot. Margot, have there been any changes in the academic integrity policy or procedures in your institution to account for the current environment? For example, regarding invigilated examinations, if so, how? Over to you.
That's a good question, thanks, Claire. And I guess I would say that we've deliberately designed our academic integrity policies, and in fact, all of our policies, to try and be broad and sort of comprehensive enough so that we don't have to be reactive when a crisis situation like this emerges. So, for example, our academic integrity policy talks about assuring ourselves that it's actually the student doing the work, whichever the assessment context they're in. So if I specifically take closed book exams, I mentioned earlier that we had been moving away from closed book exams over the last couple of years. And that, in a way, even though it was very, very rapidly done in a few of the subjects that we still had those types of exams, we already had a lot of experience in our team, if you like, on the kinds of tasks we could deliver instead of those closed book exams. I mentioned we have a career-focused education. That's really one of our core drivers of the work that we do. So we didn't really want to encourage too many closed book exams. So it was, in a way, it was welcome to be able to move, albeit a little quickly, to the types of tasks that we could say to the students, you're going to need to do this kind of thing. So now you have to do that to demonstrate your learning. So we kept that alignment very tight. It was all within our assessment policy and procedure. We also were very conscious of what some of the professional bodies might say, because some of them, for better or for worse, have really promoted the continued use of closed book exams. So they've had to allow that other tasks would be okay in this sort of interesting position we're in at the moment with the COVID pandemic. So I think that meant that we felt empowered in a way to demonstrate the work that we were doing to ensure that the academic integrity was maintained as well as the curriculum alignment. And then I would also say that all those changes needed to be tracked, they needed to be approved through the governance committee, and they'll continue to be reported as part of our monitoring process so that we are sure that those students are doing the work. I'll add that we have small classes. That's one of the things we pride ourselves on. So it does mean that another of our principles is more easily attainable, and that's that there are communications between the students and staff, and that there are connections. And that we know is one of the reasons that students might be tempted to cheat if they think that nobody cares and no one's actually likely to find out. So I hope that answered that question.
Thanks, Margot. That's brilliant. I'm going to ask Belinda 2 questions that have come up regarding her comments on the micro-credential that's at RMIT with academic integrity. So the first was, does that academic integrity micro-credential appear on students' records? And also, Belinda, how do you promote the academic integrity micro-credential, and what platform do you use for these micro-credentials? Over to you.
Oh, I'm really delighted that someone has asked about that. It's been a huge project at RMIT over the last 2 years to bring in a credential framework for our students. And the academic credential, academic integrity credential, is primarily taken by our commencing students. There are 2 ways that they can take it. It can be embedded into the courseware itself, and many of our staff do that. So that it becomes a mandatory part of the curriculum. It's almost like a hurdle that they have to do it, which is really useful because it means that our students don't just meander across the website and find it, but rather they are encouraged to take it by, they don't get a grade for it, but it's embedded in the course so that there is an expectation they have to do it. Students can, though, find it just in our marketplace, so they can go and do that themselves, but the majority of our students have it embedded in their courseware. It's been built out on the Canvas platform, so it's content that's within that platform. It's probably shareable, and I could do a little plug here if anyone wanted to contact me on that, I can drop you. It's very easy to find me. My email address is dvce@rmit.edu.au. And if you're interested in seeing whether or not you wanted to access any of that or have a look at it, I'd be more than happy to organise that for you as well. So thank you for the questions on that.
Thanks, Belinda. Thanks. So Margot, big question, without invigilation, how do we attest to the identity of students in this new mass online environment?
Now that again is a really good question, because I suppose I would throw it back to the participant in our audience, because one of the most likely environments where students are going to be cheating is actually in those large examination halls where there are invigilators walking around. So I think if we come back to our first principles around assessment, we try and build a relationship with the students. There might be mass online learning, but great learning environments still require a teacher presence and a connection with students, whether they're online or on campus. So that, I would say, is part of addressing that issue. If we get to know our students and the quality of our work, there are lots and lots of things we can do, even, for example, in some of our ELICOS contexts. The students are actually in the Zoom environment, and so there's a camera on them. But the students, as Belinda mentioned earlier, we can check the language that they're using, we can check consistency, all of those components that are the typical detection signals. For example, looking at what the references are. If we do those same things, quite frankly, it doesn't really matter whether they're on campus or online. It's kind of naive for us to think that just because we can't see any students looking at the writing on their wrist or anything, that they're not actually cheating. We need to really focus on authentic tasks with guidance for students, reducing the terrible pressures that would drive them. And some of the horror stories about what actually drives students, if you've seen some of those programs, the documentaries, and read some of the research, our duty of care says that we actually want to engage students in the assessment process, and that's a big step in the right direction, rather than this notion that we have to watch them to make sure it's them. If we build that relationship over time, we know whether it's them or not, and it takes away that responsibility of kind of catching them, as we've mentioned earlier. So I hope that helps.
Totally, Margot. I also sat myself for 2 years on the exam discipline committee, and I've learned every single way you can cheat in an exam. So I think Belinda might like to say a few things about this one as well, and then I'm going to ask a question around exams. Any tips on dealing with our professional bodies that require us to run exams? How do we feel about authentic assessment in meeting their requirements? Over to you, Belinda.
Thanks, Claire. Look, I just wanted to add to with what Margot said before. I think there's a bit of a myth around invigilated exams are, you know, the gold standard in terms of assessing knowledge. You know, in my role at RMIT, you know, I sit across all the appeals panels, and like you, Claire, I get to see all the tips and tricks. We have, it far outweighs a lot of our other sort of cheating and plagiarism issues that come up to me to have a look at, and when I assess those reports, most of the cheating occurs within exams, within invigilated environments, which I always find fascinating, you know, how they do it. But it's extraordinary what lengths students will go to, and I guess most of the time I just feel huge empathy for those students that they have to resort to that, because I know they don't necessarily purposefully go in to say I'm going to cheat to get my degree. It comes about because of a whole range of circumstances. So I think we need to be careful about saying gold standard is potentially invigilated and hold that up as the thing that we need to measure ourselves against. And go back to sort of thinking about, well, what is an authentic assessment experience, and how can our learners be involved in the process of designing even the assessment piece? But anyway, let me answer the other question around professional bodies. This one's really interesting, and I think we've got a moment in time now to actually, as a sector, to come together more strongly with our professional bodies to talk about the kinds of assessments that we're currently doing and the way we're going about assessing. And again, many of our professional bodies are actually asking our learners to be assessed on things which sometimes are quite applied, more competency oriented. So I think now is a moment, and if we can't take this moment to talk to those professional bodies to say, well, look, these are the things we're doing now, this is contemporary, this is the way the world's moving forward, then we lose the opportunity to have that discussion with our professional bodies. I also get concerned that that maybe the professional bodies are not aware of what, you know, contemporary education movements can now offer and what the advances are in terms of how we think about teaching and learning and how knowledge is acquired and the learning science that sits behind things. So I think it's behest upon us to actually play a role in educating those bodies, and rather than sort of being defensive about, you know, which is a gold standard and which isn't, I think the conversation must come back to something that sits around, you know, the contemporary world we live in and what kind of knowledge is being valued. You know, it's not an easy one. I know I've worked with, you know, a range of these accrediting bodies, and they can be very strong about, no, we need an exam, we need to do this, this, this. And that's very difficult to counter. But I think this is a moment, and let's not waste this moment in terms of having those conversations with those professional bodies.
Thanks, Belinda. Appreciate that, particularly given my background in law. Margot, I have a question specifically for you from our audience. So you mentioned that clear communications to students on academic integrity is important. Are you able to give us some more detail on what these communications entail? Are they carrot or stick communications?
Thanks, Claire. And I guess I would say that they're both carrot and stick in a way. We focus very strongly here on the education process, and as per the Texas standard, that needs to start even before the students enrol with us. So we need to let students know that academic integrity is important to our colleges or our universities, even before they engage with us. There's a lot of research about that, but in some cases, students may have been encouraged to cheat in some form by unscrupulous agents, for example. So we need to try and counter that message by clear communications that we care about the authenticity and the integrity of the work being done. My favourite examples are if we have brain surgeons and bridge builders who aren't actually qualified to do that work, that's going to be a big problem for the whole society. And that's true of all of our disciplines. So we need that to start before they come to our campuses or enrol with our courses. Then we have clear comms in all the classes. We have slides, for example, that all the academics would show in the early couple of weeks. We also have a module where students can get badges, and it's also included usually for the first years in a subject that we call Pathway to Success. That's where we help students understand what being an ICMS student is all about, and academic integrity is critical. I'd say we also engage the student bodies in that comm, so we don't have to take the responsibility for all the communications and the promotion. So the SRC, for example, might talk in their community about how they can have a two-way feedback with us so that we know what's important to them. They don't want their qualifications to be downgraded either. So they do have a vested interest in communicating and promoting that sort of the integrity. That's really what it comes back to. And I guess I would say that the stick part, we do have very clear policies. We have clear consequences designed into our procedures, and we do make those consequences transparent. Now, that's not to say that we have anything like a naming or shaming, but the academics might talk about the fact that there have been people who have been discovered in academic integrity breaches, and that there have been serious consequences. For example, if it's contract cheating, they're very, very likely to be suspended for 6 months. We believe in education, and so we try and move away from the notion of punishment And in that 6 months, they might go away and learn a little bit more about what it means to have academic integrity in their work. But we have to make that whole communication process go round. And as I mentioned earlier, it is a cycle, because if we analyse it and we pick up any trends, then it informs some of our next actions and we can help mitigate some of those risks. Back over to you, Claire.
Thanks, Margot. Great answer. The next question I'm actually personally interested in the response to, so it's for Belinda. It's quite a long question. I work with a lot of academics who have a class size from 400 to 900. I promote authentic assessment extensively, and if they must have an exam, I guide them in writing authentic exams that are case study or problem based. They continue to tell me they don't have enough time to mark these. I show them ways of reducing the marking time, but they are fixated on automatic marking. What suggestions can you make when we have such large class sizes?
Run for the hills, Claire. Run for the hills. I think this is a problem that we've all got, and it's around, there's sort of several parts to this question, because it's also around the massification of higher education or tertiary education, and the cost associated with potentially having assessments that may take more time to mark or be engaged with. And the time and workloads of our staff, and when you wrap all those things up together, you find a lot of the time that our teachers and our academic staff just literally do not have the time to be able to churn through, the 900 whatever we're going to ask them to do, instead of doing an exam, which can be just sort of pushed through the machine, and it's multiple choice, etc., etc. So decisions how we manage time and massification sometimes get confused with student outcomes and that transformative experience where education is motivating for our students and provides, opportunity for students to actually demonstrate, what knowledge they have. But we still, on the other hand, have to manage those time constraints and the way people perceive assessment. I think the thing that I've always been intrigued about too is that, we think in education that, that constructive alignment piece to me is so important, where, your learning outcomes are then practiced through the learning activities, and then you assess the learning outcomes based on that. That by outsourcing, in a sense, the assessment piece to something that doesn't involve the academic per se, then, or the teacher, I think you break, the integrity of the entire academic cycle, let alone the integrity of the academic, the assessment itself. So I don't think there's an easy answer for you, because you're addressing probably from the staff who are saying, oh look, I just want to do it how I've always done it, because that's just the easiest way to do it, and I cannot imagine on any level marking 900 assessments, with, well, what student outcomes do we desire? So the question we might ask ourselves, well, exactly what you've been trying to promote to your staff. So what assessments will answer the time and load issue without being overly costly, that will also provide the authentic assessment? And you'll probably find that it's a continuous assessment model that will do that, so that the assessments are collectively brought through the curriculum. So it might not be that there are 3 assessments, but there could be weekly assessments that each time are getting harder as they go. They could still be multiple choice, and they could be cognitively getting harder and harder. And they could be adaptive assessments, so with those large classes, I think you've got to sort of take that picture a bit bigger and think about the adaptive assessment paradigm that can actually do that work and reduce time on task. But it's a sophisticated assessment model in order to be able to do it. So if you haven't run for the hills, you can run back from the hills now and maybe talk to your people, talk to some of your clever people about adaptive assessment, and that might help them in this scenario.
Thanks, Belinda. And talking about time constraints, it's time for us to conclude today. Each week, sorry, I'm just waiting for the camera to come back on me. Yay, thank you. Every week, so the questions that we didn't get to, we are looking at providing answers to you on the Texter website. We'll tell you more next week. The questions that we don't answer every week, there's one in particular that we have been asked for 3 weeks in a row around designing STEM online. So things like chemistry, things that are traditionally based in labs. And I think next week we should definitely include that in our webinar. So just to let you know, we are seeing those questions and we are looking at them every week. Today, though, I'd love to thank our two Deputy Vice-Chancellors, Dr. Margot McNeill, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Learning and Teaching at the International College of Management, Sydney, and Professor Belinda Tynan, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Education at RMIT. And thanks everyone for your participation. We love seeing you here. If you want to give me a thumbs up, how am I going? How are we going? Any comments, chats back, please let us know. And you can also email your feedback as always to onlinelearning@texa.gov.au. Check out the TEXA website, there's heaps on there and the previous webinars are there as well. And next week we have in the hot seat Liz Heathcote from AIB and Dr. David Bowser from Curio on the topic of designing curriculum for an online environment. Thanks everyone for attending. We hope you've really enjoyed this week's Going Online, Reimagining Teaching and Learning, and we'll see you next week. Bye, see you later.